Okay, so the next stage of Augustine's journey in his search for truth is the discovery of Plato. We're skipping way ahead. Augustine is now, he's spent years and years searching through the writings of philosophy, still conceiving of God as material. And then in his 30th year, when he lives in Carthage, he discovers Plato. And Plato is going to be very important for him. So the ideas of Plato come to Augustine through a school of thought called the Platonists. They read and revived and studied and taught the ideas of Plato in Augustine's time. And he's going to find two very important things in the writings of Plato. One is about God, and one is about human beings. And so some books the Platonists translated from Greek into Latin. And them I found, though not in these very words, yet the thing itself improved by all sorts of reasons, that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Augustine says, I discovered in Plato what I came eventually to recognize as the God of Christianity, the God of Judaism, the one all-powerful creator of the universe. And he also says he discovers humans. He discovers that man is a soul. And he also discovers that while man has a soul, a spiritual aspect, and God is a spirit, that the soul of man, though it gives testimony of the light, is not itself the light. So he's quoting the Gospel of St. John here, but I think we can also recognize the allegory of the cave. So Augustine studies Plato, he says, this is the Christian God. This is it. And God doesn't have to be material. He can be a spirit. It makes sense when he studies Plato. He says it makes sense. God is a spirit. There's a real world. There's a real intelligible realm where the light that gives light to everything is God, a pure spirit. And humans participate in that spirit because we have a spiritual soul, but we're not the same as God. So that's so exciting for Augustine. And he's going to talk a lot about what he learns from studying Plato. However, he does note here at the bottom that what he does not find in the writings of Plato is Christ. Because Christ was not there, but God was. And he marvels a little bit at this discovery that he makes. And I marvel to find that at last I loved you. This is section 17. And not some phantom instead of you. He's like, I found God in Plato. Not a phantom, not like something that I imagined as really big, but actual God. Yet I did not stably enjoy my God, but was ravished to you by your beauty, yet soon was torn away from you by my own weight, and fell again with torment to lower things. So even though Augustine has read Plato, he's read about the form of the good, he's read about the allegory of the cave, he's read about how all being participates in some way in God's being, but yet God is not the biggest being, God is being himself. God is not the most beautiful thing, God is beauty himself. God is not the most good thing, God is goodness himself. God is his own category. And that's Plato's idea. And Augustine says, wow, that's it, that's God. And he loves him. But he still falls into his own carnal ways. Like, this is an exciting discovery of him, but he says, I still was pulled down into desiring other things, carnal habit, as he calls it. But even in that, he marvels at how he can think about, well, even the beautiful things that I enjoy, like beautiful bodies, they also help me to think about the beauty of God. He said, I was now studying the grounds. Like, why do I love female bodies so much, for example? I was studying the ground of my admiration for the beauty of bodies, whether celestial, like the stars, or of earth, like of women, and on what authority I might rightly judge of things mutable, changeable, and say this ought to be so, or this not ought to be. Like, how do I make judgments of she's really beautiful and she's not? He says, inquiring then what was the source of my judgment, when I did judge, I discovered the immutable and the true eternity of truth above my changing mind. So he says, this was the moment where I jumped over the divided line, where I understood that if I'm judging some things as more beautiful and some as less, some women as more beautiful and some as less, I'm judging by a standard that there must be a total beauty, pure beauty, perfect beauty. Thus by stages I passed from bodies to the soul, which uses the body for its perceiving, and from this to the soul's inner powers, where the body senses present external things, as indeed the beasts are able. And from there I passed on to reasoning power, to which referred for judgment what is received from the body's senses. This too realized that it was mutable in me, and arose on its own understanding. It withdrew my thought from its habitual way, abstracting the confused crowd of phantasms, that it might find what light suffused it. And when with utter certainty it cried aloud that the immutable was to be preferred to the mutable, and how it had come to know the immutable itself, for it had not come to some knowledge of the immutable, it could not have known it as certainly preferable to the mutable. Thus, in the thrust of a trembling glance, my mind arrived at that which is. This is Augustine is describing his own ascent of the divided line here. How he moves from beautiful things like women to thinking about, what is beauty in my soul? What is the beautiful soul, perhaps, of this woman first? And then to contemplating what is the inner power by which I understand this, going on to understanding what is the intellect itself, going on to abstract from using my intellect to abstract from beautiful people to the form of beauty, eventually to understand that if changing things have these qualities of beauty and goodness, there must be something unchanging that's total beauty, total goodness. And this, he says, he arrives to this understanding with certainty, this moment of nous, this moment of insight, where he understands the form of the good. And he delights at it. And although he says he lacked the strength to hold my gaze there, and you can think of the allegory of the cave, it's difficult to look directly at the sun, but he kept a memory of the delight and desire of something as if he caught a fragrance of it in this moment when studying Plato. Okay, and so this causes him, his study of Plato also causes him to rethink evil. Remember, he'd thought, like the Manichees, that evil was like a thing, like evil existed and it fought against good, and they were both like really big, took up a lot of space in the universe and fought each other. But now, he says in section 12, it became clear to me that corruptible things are good. If they were supremely good, they could not be corrupted. So he's like, even things that can change, so material things, they must be good. If they were totally good, they wouldn't be able to change. Like, God can't change. But also, if they were not good at all, they could not be corrupted. So if they were supremely good, they would be incorruptible, like God. If they were in no way good, there would be nothing in them that might corrupt. For corruption damages, and unless it diminishes goodness, it would not damage. So he says, what is corruption? What is sickness? What is death? What is even movement? It's corrupting something good. It's taking away a goodness. It's damaging goodness. So he says, for corruption to happen, for any change to happen, there has to be goodness there. So Augustine, from studying Plato, comes to understand that anything that exists has an element of goodness. It participates in the form of the good, even if it's material and can corrupt. And he says, because if it couldn't corrupt, it would either be God, the incorruptible, or it would just not exist, because if there's nothing to, like, only goodness can corrupt, because corruption means to be made worse. So there has to be a goodness in order for it to be made worse. Thus, whatsoever things are good, and that evil whose origin I sought is not a substance, because if it were a substance, it would be good. So now Augustine's like, whoa, evil can't exist as a thing, because to exist is to be good. And evil, by definition, is bad. So evil must not be a substance. It must not be like a thing that actually exists. And so he has this revelation, and then he turns back to Scripture. He says, I'm going to continue my search for truth in Scripture now that I think I've discovered God in Plato. Now I seized greedily upon the adorable writings of your Spirit, and especially on the Apostle Paul. And I found in those difficulties in which I'd once seemed to me that he contradicted himself, and that the text of his discourse did not agree with the testimonies of the law and the prophets, it vanished away. He's like, wow, the first time I read this, I thought there were all these difficulties, but now it's different. In that pure eloquence, I saw one face, and I learned to rejoice with trembling. I found that whatever truth I had read in the Platonists was said here with the praise of your grace. So Augustine, one of the things he rejoices in at this point in his life is in the total complementarity and unity of truth. I mean, Augustine, he's been on this intellectual journey since he read Cicero all those years ago when he was 16. Now he's 30. And so he's been seeking truth, and he just wants truth to harmonize. He's like, if truth is really truth, the truth we discover through science has to be compatible with the truth we discover through philosophy, has to be compatible with the truth we get in Scripture, if Scripture is really true. And so he didn't find that in the Manichees, but he thinks he's found it now, and Plato was the key. He says, I see the truth in Plato, I see that same truth in the gospel and in the writings of St. Paul. But he again notes that there's nothing in the writing of Plato or the Platonists about Christ. Their pages contain nothing of the face of that love, the face of Christ, the tears of confession, your sacrifice, an afflicted spirit, a contrite and humbled heart. But he has this experience reading St. Paul, maybe because he's experienced the truth of Plato, where he gives us another chance. He says that marvelously these truths, so he's like, well, the incarnation of Christ, or the truth of God, who God is the Father, he says that is in Plato. And if that is in Plato, and it's the same God as in Scripture, then what God in Scripture says must be true. And what he says is that he's three persons, and one of those persons is Jesus Christ. So he reads Scripture in a whole new way, now that he's been convinced or open to the truth of Plato's writing. So he's marvelously these truths graved themselves in my heart when I read the least of your apostles, and I looked upon your works and trembled. Augustine's in this, I think he beautifully embodies reverence for truth. He's blown away by this discovery that he's made inside himself. However, it's important to note that here, Augustine doesn't become Christian. He has an intellectual understanding where he says the Christian God should be true. Plato's ideas, I'm convinced with certainty, are true. And I'm convinced with certainty that the ideas of Plato also appear in Scripture. But he does not yet become baptized. And I think one of the images that really describes where he is right now is highlighted here in the middle of the page on the right. He says, it's one thing to see the land of peace from a wooded mountaintop, yet not to find the way to it and struggle hopelessly from far from the way with hosts of the fugitive deserters from God. So I think Augustine, while he's not struggling so viscerally anymore with anything like Manichaeism or his own other carnal desires, I guess, keeping him from God, he still hasn't quite made this ascent of faith. It's like he's looking from a mountain at this and saying that it's true, but he's not all the way there. So this is where we end for today. We'll look in Book 8, is the book where we will witness Augustine's actual conversion.